Okay, we're live.
All right, we are live. Welcome to the Real Crusades History live stream, everybody. This is going to be a very special episode. I'm happy to welcome here with us today Joanna Arman. Joanna is the author of a book that I have come to really enjoy, and that is The Warrior Queen, The Life and Legend of Æthelflæd, the daughter of Alfred the Great. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, all about this aspect of Joanna's research. So, Joanna, thanks for being here. How are you doing?
Doing great, doing great.
All right. Glad to have you here. So, Joanna, let's kind of get started with some of the questions that we talked about earlier.
They're great, yeah.
All right. We actually have some questions this time. I know last time we kind of did a freewheeling kind of live stream.
It was fun though.
It was fun. But yeah, let's start off just kind of talking about some of your background. So talk to us a little bit about yourself, your educational history, and how you got interested into this particular aspect of history.
My education, it was really normal British school. The downside of that, of course, was in the 90s and early 2000s, is we did just modern history. We didn't do medieval in those days. The way I basically got into medieval history is I left school realising I knew nothing about what happened between 1066 and 1485. Yeah, literally nothing. So I'm like, there's this 400-year gap of surely stuff happened. And I was always listening to documentaries back in the old days, the big names of British history. That was Simon Sharma and a few others. They're talking about all these stuff that happened in the 1300s and 1400s. I'm like, why don't we get taught this? So I left school, started reading. And the rest is history, so you could say. About
and that led you to the Anglo-Saxons?
Yes, we learned nothing about before 1066 either. So the whole Anglo-Saxon age is just like a void. It still is in a lot of schools, actually. It's just like nothing. The Battle of Hastings and nothing, essentially. Yeah, so I read everything from Bede, the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, which everyone should read at some point. Yeah, everyone should read that. Shakespeare's history plays, everything I could get on the medieval period. About 2-3 years, and I finally decided to study medieval history at uni. And that's why I'm here, how I'm here. The Anglo-Saxons, very specifically, I think they're my first love in history, really, since Bede.
So what got you interested in, the Anglo-Saxons in particular, and Lady Æthelflæd, the daughter of Alfred the Great?
Well, I'd always read the odd references to her. Every now and again in the book, there was this odd reference to Aethelflaed, and I'd always known that Alfred the Great had a daughter who was quite formidable. As I say, the Anglo-Saxons were my favourite people in history, always have been since Bede. Didn't learn much about them, but they were always. I think I would have done more on them had there been those resources available. But what really got me onto Aethelflaed was there was a documentary, a BBC documentary in 2012, on the family of Alfred the Great. And one episode was just devoted to Aethelflaed and her brother. And that convinced me I wanted to do her. I actually wrote about her for my master's dissertation, and a lot of that eventually went into the book. Of course, it was a lot more expanded than that. But that was really what got me on the track of Aethelflaed.
So I know we were going to jump into the Viking invasions and Alfred the Great, but I did kind of want to ask you, maybe if you want to set the stage a little bit for, Anglo-Saxon England. I mean, who were the Anglo-Saxons, and how do we get from, their arrival in England to Alfred the Great? Like, where does Alfred the Great fit in all that? I mean, I know that's kind of a big
that's fine
topic, but if you want to kind of give us, I know you're very good at like these overviews. So,
well, I mean, the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons is a huge open debate amongst historians. So the official version, which like Bede and all the others were, is that they came over in a bunch of boats in about the 5th century AD. One theory is that they were hired as mercenaries by the Roman Britons to actually protect them from other Celts. Yeah, the Irish and the Scots were attacking. So they hired German mercenaries to help them, and their mercenaries ended up turning on them. And that's where the Anglo-Saxons came from. That's also, incidentally, the 5th century is where a lot of the King Arthur stories come from. And he's almost always fighting the Anglo-Saxons, which is interesting. You fast forward to the late 8th century. That's when the first Viking raids start. I always forget the exact date of the first Viking raid on Lindisfarne. I know it's 780 something, but I always forget the exact date. I think it might be 783. Viking historians can beat me later on for this.
I think it's 793.
793, that's it.
Yeah, because I was actually
Thank you for showing me up. Yes.
Not the. I just remember that because I was just reading about it just recently. So.
Yeah, that was it. So yeah, the first Viking raid on Lindisfarne, that was 793. Alfred is born in about, they reckon about 849. The difference really with Alfred the Great is before that, the Vikings had always come, raided and left. That was the Norwegian ones. But when Alfred was a teenager, the Danes came. The difference with the Danes is they stayed. They didn't go home for the winter. They stayed and they started taking more and more territory. That was the Great Heathen Army, as it was known, under Guthrum. So by this time, as your very, very nice map shows, this is actually slightly after the Viking conquest. This time you've had the Anglo-Saxons in Britain for 300 to 400 years. They've established a series of sort of smaller kingdoms. There's Wessex, East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria. There's sort of maybe a couple of other smaller kingdoms as well, sub-kingdoms. There's certain struggles for independence, but that's what England looks like in the 8th century. I mean, Wales, of course, has its own small kingdoms as well. Scotland has its own kingdoms. And then the Vikings come and, throw I'm going to say a wrench in the works because you're in America. We're going to say they throw a wrench in the works. And Alfred is, I believe, in Mercia actually when the Vikings first get there, because his brother-in-law is the king of Mercia, Burgrad, married to his sister Aethelsflæd. He has to go home with his older brother. And the rest, as they say, is history. They eventually get to Wessex, drive him out. He manages a spectacular comeback at the Battle of Æthelflæd. Is it a Battle of Æthelflæd? Yes, when he defeats Guthrum and manages to regain his kingdom. That's a brief overview of the first part of Alfred's reign, anyway.
Yeah, so basically we've got these different kingdoms. You know, England is not one entity at this point, and Alfred, his dynasty comes from Wessex. So they kind of call it the Wessex dynasty, usually is how you see it referred to, I guess.
Yes, it's all really kind of fluid at this time. I mean, Alfred's dynasty was only about 3 generations old. There have been so many ruling dynasties in each of the different kingdoms. Shortly before Alfred's, there was a different dynasty in Wessex. I think it only really went back to his grandfather. His father was called Æthelwulf. His grandfather, I think it was Æthelbert, something like that. Yeah,
it's Ethel something.
Yes, Ethel something. Yes, always Ethel. But his dynasty wasn't actually that old in Wessex. The trouble with a lot of early Saxon dynasties is we don't know where they came from originally. We don't know that they sort of just sometimes really come out of nowhere. But they like to trace their descent back to Cerdic, who was a legendary 5th century king of Wessex. You have to sort of take that with a bit of a pinch of salt, but
I know before the Vikings showed up, it seemed like there was a lot of conflict among the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms.
Oh yeah.
But the Vikings kind of change all that, and they actually take over a considerable part of England. And Alfred and his dynasty are among the only ones left. I think at one point they are pretty much the only Anglo-Saxons left. So, like as we were talking about, Alfred has this comeback at the Battle of Edington, and the rest of his career is pretty interesting. I mean, he creates kind of this revival, or the beginnings of it, and I guess that'll kind of lead us to his daughter Æthelflæd. So where does she
Indeed, the cultural revival.
Mm-hmm.
Well, she was born, we don't know precisely when, possibly about 870. I favour the date of about 870. So talking about, he's probably about 19 or 20 years old. She's, of course, his firstborn daughter, his firstborn child by his wife. He might have had other children before her by another woman, we don't know. She is possibly about 10, 11, approaching her teenage years when his program of cultural renewal really starts. She was educated. She definitely did have an education like her brother. This is what the chronicles tell us. There's this myth, actually, that Alfred the Great himself was illiterate. That's probably not true. The literacy was he could probably read English. It was Latin that he didn't learn to read until later on in his life. Yeah, because illiterate in those days could actually just mean you didn't know Latin. You might well be able to read and even write in your own mother tongue, and they'd still call you illiterate. So, yeah, Alfred probably was literate in English. His children learned to at least quite probably read English. So they've got a decent standard of education. I mean, I know that other historians and myself have put on the things that they would have learned. Poetry, probably, some of the epic sagas. There's a story about how Alfred got his tutor when he was a young child to recite a book of poetry to him because he liked the illuminated manuscript on the first page. That his mother read it to him, he learnt it and recited it back to her and won the book in a sort of competition between the children. And I think that's what a lot of education was in those days. It was because books weren't widely available. It was you would memorize them. You'd recite them back. Because, of course, you know, books took a lot of time to produce. But she would certainly have had that. Aethelflæd would have been around when her father was building the boroughs, the cities, or the fortified towns to keep the Vikings away. She was there. I mean, it's debate about whether she was around when he went into exile in the Somerset levels. She would have been about 7 or 8 at the time. She would certainly have remembered, I think, the Viking attack on Chippenham, which was where they were based when Guthrum came and they had to flee. So I think it must have left an imprint on her mind that this was something that could happen. You know, everything could hang by a thread. She saw all this. She witnessed all this. She was there. Her father involved her. There's an account how shortly after her marriage, when she was about 16 or 17, she was actually invited to they call it a conference. It was sort of a meeting about the building and planning of cities. So she was included in everything from the outset. Her father didn't, discriminate against her for being a girl. In fact, she was married to the Lord of the Mercians, so she was important to him in that regard of forging an alliance with Mercia.
All right, so that kind of gives us some background for Æthelflæd. So what we're kind of talking about is the fact that she would have been inculcated into her father's project of reviving Anglo-Saxon England. And she played a big role in kind of moving that forward, I guess.
Yes, in fact, one of the people who was involved in her father's renewal program was Bishop, I always get his name wrong, Bishop Wearforth, I think it was, of Worcester, which was in the Kingdom of Mercia. King Alfred actually dedicated a book to him. He was a Mercian bishop and he served under Aethelflaed afterwards. So there was definitely that connection there. He dedicated and gave a book to him, which was in Worcester what is now Worcester Cathedral, but that was actually one of the places where Aethelflaed lived for a while. I believe she made quite a substantial grant to Worcester Cathedral. Yeah, she did make a considerable amount for prayers for her soul. I think she gave some very ornate, sorry, not a good time of day. She gave, I think it was a jewelled chalice to Worcester Cathedral at one point and referred to her friend, Bishop Werfeth. Same man. It's quite likely he even showed her the book that Alfred gave him. I mean, she was there. He must have been, this is a present from your father. She would have been honoured to see this. She certainly knew about what was going on.
So after Alfred's death, what was her role?
Right, that's where things start to get a bit hazy with Æthelflæd. You see, her father died about 899 or 900, depending on what dating system you use. She doesn't really start to come to the forefront of events until about 910, 911. I mean, her husband died in, 913? So for the immediate years after her death, we don't really know what she's doing. She's in Mercia. Obviously, she's ruling Mercia. She's not called Queen, at least not officially in Wessex anyway. But she's certainly ruling as the consort of Mercia.
Was she involved in the rule of Mercia before her father's death? Because she was married to
Lord Aethelflaed.
To the ruler of Mercia, right? Okay, so she already was involved in government before Alfred died.
Yes, she was involved in the government of the Mercians. I mean, in Wessex, they had this rule that the wife of the king couldn't be known as a queen, but they had no such rule in Wessex. Sorry, in Mercia. They had no such. In fact, her aunt had been Queen of Mercia, Aethelswith. Okay. Alfred the Great's sister. So there was definitely a precedent there for her family. And her name is mentioned alongside her husband's in charters, as the aforementioned in Worcester. She appears alongside him in documents. They're the Lord and Lady of the Mercians. So she's definitely co-ruling, probably raising her daughter, who was her only child, in fact. She's there and she is involved.
And I know one thing we talked about last time was, the popular culture portrayals of Æthelflæd, and one of the themes that seems to come up in TV shows and that kind of thing is this idea that her husband was kind of a weak figure. Yeah. But I've found, from what I've read about the period that and I forget what was his name again?
Æthelred.
Æthelred, that's right.
Lord Æthelred, yeah.
Yeah, he was very closely working with Alfred during kind of the toughest years of the Viking Wars, and he was a competent commander. So what are some of your thoughts about that? Like, do we know anything about their relationship, Æthelflæd's relationship with the Lord of Mercia, and, what sort of person he actually was?
Well, I mean, we don't usually know a lot of personal details from this time period, but I would say it's very unlikely that he was like he's portrayed in a certain TV series. I mean, even the writer of the book said that's a fictionalized account. It's just an old trope, really, of fiction, the useless, abusive husband. It's just basically done to set her up with another character. But I won't go into that too much more. The Anglo-Saxons were pragmatists. If Æthelred had really been that useless and that incompetent, he wouldn't have stayed in rule for very long. Mm-hmm. They would have deposed him. It's just they needed a strong leader who could lead your people, especially at the time like the Viking Age. Yeah, he'd have been out if he'd really been that bad. We don't know much about their relationship. They seem to have, whether they love each other or not, we don't know. It's an open question. The fact they only had one child together, their daughter, is interesting. There may have been miscarriages, possibly. One later account says that she decided not to have any more children. That it was her choice because having her daughter nearly killed her, but that is actually a later tradition. They seem to have worked very well together, and the fact that she was later made ruler of Mercia when he died And that wasn't something that happened without the assent of, the lords and the nobility of the kingdom. They had to give the okay to that, and they had to trust her.
So one thing that I think is kind of interesting is, her role does seem kind of unique, in this period. I mean, we don't see much, a lot of female rulers during this period who seem to kind of stand out, and she really does, which is kind of intriguing. So there
That's why I love her.
Yeah. So there must have been something unique about her, but I also think, kind of, what you mentioned about her choice not to have any more children. I mean, if she did choose that or not, we're not sure, but it does seem like there was this, and you can kind of tell me what you think about this, but this close association with moving forward with her father's vision of things, and kind of like the quote unquote Wessex dynasty in general. I mean, she was very.
Was it intentional? Yeah, that she didn't want anyone to threaten. It's an interesting question. I mean, we don't know the answer. There have been different theories and speculations. Was it intentional? If she had a son, he could potentially be the King of Mercia, the independent King of Mercia. And she was actually referred to in a few places as the Queen of the Mercians. She wasn't in Wessex or anywhere else, but there was always that thing with Mercian independence. I mean, officially her husband worked with Alfred the Great, but there was definitely that strong spirit of independence in Mercia. There actually was a time, I think, in the late 10th century where Mercia did break away from Wessex for a time. There was actually, I believe, 2 kings of England at one point. That didn't last very long, but there was always that desire for independence. So it makes you wonder whether she was going on with a sort of long-term plan there, or was thinking at least strategically.
Yeah, because she did take a very active role in forming her nephew, I believe it was, right?
Aethelstan, indeed. Aethelstan.
Right. Who is the son of Edward, correct?
Her brother. Edward, yes, her brother. Yeah. Yes.
It was kind of a cooperation between Æthelflæd and her brother to some extent, too. I mean, they were kind of, the two of them kind of moved forward with their father's vision. And then in Alfred's grandson, they both kind of cultivated the continuation of that too, or that seems to be the impression I get. So,
well, Aethelstan was actually fostered, which is a medieval practice of sending your son or your male heir to someone else, either a relative or, in some cases, another nobleman's court to be raised, basically. And Aethelstan was fostered in Mercia by his aunt and uncle, Æthelflæd and Aethelred, Lord and Lady of the Mercians. He went hunting in Mercia. He basically grew up in Mercia, essentially. There's a charter from it was a long time later, one church where he referred to his beloved aunt of beloved memory, which is actually really kind of says something, I think, about their relationship. I almost think she was like an alternative mother figure to him.
Yeah, so that's always been interesting to me, is just the way that, this dynasty kind of operated in this broader way. I mean, that it involves kind of the bringing together of these two Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Wessex and Mercia. So let's jump over. That is Aethelstan there on the screen.
I'm sure that's not a concern people.
Exactly how he looks.
Who knows?
But I wanted to also jump over to some questions, just because we're starting to get some. So we already kind of answered this one. This is from Quethsigal. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. How influential was
I've only just found your comments. Yeah.
How influential was Æthelflæd in raising of Aethelstan, the first king of the English? And that's something I guess we should mention too, is that this idea that Aethelstan was kind of, the first king of England. I guess that's debatable, but you've got a more united England at that point. And that was sort of the work really it was the work of Æthelflæd, her brother Edward, of course, their father, Alfred.
Well, he became ruler of Mercia first, actually. I don't remember whether he was king of Mercia. I don't think he was officially recognized as king of Mercia, but he succeeded in Mercia first. It wasn't until slightly afterwards that he actually came down to Wessex and got crowned king there. So he was essentially the heir of Lady Æthelflæd.
Mm-hmm. And then we've got from Angie M. Rumor has it that Æthelflæd allegedly had a son as well, Arnulf. Can you tell me something about that? Well, I guess we'll ask Joanna.
I've never heard of Arnulf de Bevere. De Bevere sounds like a French name, and surnames weren't a thing in those days. Yeah, that sounds like something that probably came along in the 11th or 12th century. So we don't know whether she had miscarriages or maybe lost children. She may have done. There's no record of a son. And that would have been a pretty major event, to have remarked on. Very unlikely. Whether he died young, maybe as an infant, yeah, I've not heard of this.
And then we got another one from Quetzalcoatl here.
Thank you.
He says, I really enjoyed her book, by the way. I think the fact that she was able to rule it all after Æthelred's death is testament to how strong she was. Very impressive during that time. And just to kind of recap, this is Joanna's book.
It's funny. A year after it came out, there were 3 other biographies of Æthelflæd because it was the anniversary of her death in 2018. So yeah, I was the first off the mark in 2017.
Well, there's a couple of things I really like about yours. First of all, it's very much in a narrative type format, so we get kind of the story of her life, as much as you can present that in the study of a figure from that period. We do get kind of the narrative of her father's reign into her reign. It's a really good history just of the Anglo-Saxon wars with the Vikings in general for that period, but also it is a very serious scholarly type of approach. So it's not, you're not getting a bunch of stuff that makes you kind of think, okay, well, this is more pop history than serious history. It really does kind of take a serious historical approach. So those two, combining those two things is not always easy. And I think you do.
Well, whenever something's not proven, I say this isn't proven, this is just conjecture. I think you always have to be honest with your readers. They trust us to recount history for them, and we need to. Don't insult your readers' intelligence. Tell them what was known and what isn't.
Mm-hmm. So that's a really good thing about the book. So I recommend it. So guys, there is a link below the stream to check out Joanna's book. Pick up a copy and learn more about the Anglo-Saxon period and this really fascinating figure of Alfred the Great's daughter, the Lady Æthelflæd. In some ways, she's sort of a foreshadowing of a lot of the famous medieval queens and women from medieval Europe who do become really important and interesting. I mean, Eleanor of Aquitaine, figures like that. But this is this is a lot earlier than when we really start seeing a lot of prominent women, but yet she does show up and she really does make an impression in this period. So yeah, I've always found, I think it's makes the history a little more interesting too. I mean, we've got this great story with Alfred the Great, and then we have this really interesting female figure kind of come on the stage. And so it kind of enhances that period's interest factor, at least for me. So
exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, what I like is she defies the expectations in the sense that she's not a Viking. Everyone thinks Viking warrior woman, and then you've got Æthelflæd.
Yeah, and that's a good point. The Vikings TV show with the girls running around with swords and shields is, I mean, it's not historical. Let's be honest. That's not what Viking women were doing. They weren't. And Æthelflæd herself likely was not swinging a sword around. She was in a position where she was overseeing things. I'm sure she had some male generals who were assisting her. So yeah. And this,
I mean, in a lot of ways, it was The kings did lead people into battle. There was always a chance the king could die. So, you know, it was a very precarious thing.
And this image on the cover of your book, I'm going to jump down to this picture here. This is actually a statue. You probably can tell us a few things about this statue and its location, Joanna.
That is in Tamworth, which is a little market town in the county of Staffordshire. Nowadays, it's only a small place. It was actually for a time Alfred the Great, Æthelflæd's capital. She decided to make it her capital. She moved there, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, in 913. Actually, she renewed the borough there. She rebuilt St. Edith's Church, which stands to this day. And the very interesting thing about Tamworth is it was right on the border of the Danelaw, literally right on the border. It's a few miles away. So it was an interesting place to choose to build her capital. It was an ancient Mercian city. I think it was Offa, who was a 9th century king of Mercia, was also meant to have had his capital there at one point. And she was very influential of Mercia, so she liked to, I think she claimed him among her ancestors at one point. He was known as a particularly great king of the Mercians. He actually gave the West Saxons a run for their money at one point. Was known as an overlord of sort of all the English kingdoms. So she was thinking strategically, definitely with Tamworth, but also thinking about the Mercian legacy as well. This statue actually was put up in 1911. That was the anniversary of her becoming Lady of the Mercians. There's actually now another one in Tamworth that was put up in 2018. I'm not.
It's not as attractive, is it?
Yeah, it has its merits. It has its merits. Right? Yeah, it has its merits. I've seen it. It's just in a really inconvenient location. It's right on a roundabout, which is a British road thing. All the cars drive past it.
And this statue from 1911, I mean, we're kind of looking at a period of time when there was kind of some increasing interest in Anglo-Saxon history, and maybe, I mean, I imagine kind of during the Romantic era and that kind of thing. Aethelflaed would be a figure that would be attractive. I mean, they
were quite into that. I mean, there's a statue of her father in Winchester that was also put up early 20th century. So it's definitely part of a series. And there's another one in a little town called Wantage, which is, I don't remember whether it's where he was born. I think it might be where he was born, yeah. About the same time, sort of late Victorian, early Georgian period. Definitely the romanticisation of the Middle Ages and all things Anglo-Saxon. They just liked it so much at that time. They decided to put these things up for the anniversaries.
Yeah, this was a period when the English were obviously sort of at this kind of the peak,
so it's officially put up in 1930, not 1911.
Oh, okay. But yeah, it's got kind of almost that Victorian kind of flair to it. I mean,
definitely,
which I like that stuff. I think that's a good style. It's not always perfectly historically accurate, but it conveys a certain feeling that I think is. I think it's good. It's a beautiful style of art. So
I think it is, and that little boy is meant to be Aethelstan, in fact, incidentally.
Right, which again kind of points back to this relationship that we were talking about. He was kind of a son to her, and
almost a surrogate son. It was put up actually to commemorate her rebuilding of Tamworth in 913. Though the tradition is a bit inaccurate, is that she built Tamworth Castle. Tamworth Castle is a Norman castle. She didn't build a castle of any description. She built the borough, which was the fortified settlement.
Since you brought up the Normans, I think we should we should ask you what you think of the Normans, Joanna, just to get a little controversy going.
I'm ambiguous on the Normans. I mean, I'm from Sussex, which
The stupid Normans, right?
yeah, Sussex has a bit of a ancestral argument with William the Conqueror. Yeah, namely that he landed in Sussex, and yeah, King Harold was from Sussex as well. So yeah, we're not great fans of his here.
So yeah, when I was in Italy recently, I met a girl who was from Essex. And she told me that she said, yeah, I'm from Essex. I said, oh, Essex. So like the opposite of Wessex. And she said, what's Wessex? Is Wessex do people not use that term anymore?
A lot of people haven't sort of heard of Wessex. I think because Essex is still a county.
Okay.
Whereas Wessex isn't a county. Wessex was a region and a kingdom, but it's not a county. There's no county of Wessex. Yeah, because Essex is still a county, people still know about it. It's like Sussex is still actually a county. So that name is still there for that region. Wessex is a name of a region, but not a county. So yeah, not everyone's heard of Wessex.
Yeah, for me, England is just perpetually in the medieval world. You know.
Yeah, we're
here in the States. I can just like still see England from that period. So
you can still see peasants toiling in the field.
If I show up, what's going on here? Where are the Normans? Where's Alfred the Great?
We've got to pay our rents to our feudal overlords.
Okay, I'm going to stop being an American here, or being an excessive American here. But speaking of that, we got a comment from Erav. You guys need to start coming up with handles that I can pronounce. Here in America, we aren't taught about the Middle Ages either. And I guess that's from our initial comments. We were talking about the lack of...
It has started to change a little bit in schools now. Last few years, they are learning a little bit more sort of about the period after the Norman conquest and a bit about the Wars of the Roses and stuff.
So is the Norman conquest is kind of a big deal for English school children? That's sort of the...
Yes, it's almost like when English history began. No, it's not when English history began at all. Yeah.
So there's not, much looking at Roman Britain or,
No, you do get looking at Roman Britain, but that's more primary school, which is 11 or earlier, age 11 or earlier. So you do get that, but then it tends to jump directly onto the Battle of Hastings. Or more often than not, it jumps directly onto the Tudors, or at least it did in my day.
It's kind of interesting how in modern, and you can kind of speak to this better than me, but how in modern English identity, there's more of an identification with the Anglo-Saxons than with the Normans. I mean, the Normans are kind of perpetually invaders, whereas the Anglo-Saxons have more become almost the ancestral English, I guess.
It depends, really. Nowadays, yeah, not a great deal. Not really so much more nowadays. More in the Victorian period, certainly. I mean, due to the Second World War, the Anglo-Saxons, obviously, certain things happened, and the Anglo-Saxons aren't as famous as they used to be. I mean, you ask the average English person who the Anglo-Saxons were, and they'd probably say the guys who lost the Battle of Hastings.
Okay.
Yeah. It doesn't mean a great deal. I mean, we might see it as a period in history, but it's referred to usually collectively as the pre-conquest period, because we do share our island with the Welsh and the Scottish people, and the Celts. We're not the only ones here. Yeah, we don't generally see the Normans as our ancestors. I mean, they are some people's ancestors.
Yeah, that seems to be kind of a universal thing. I mean, I've noticed from running my YouTube channel. I mean, when you do something about the Normans, there are a lot of people who love Norman history, but it seems like they're not from the British Isles. I mean, if you're from the British Isles, you just kind of revile the Normans.
Not everyone does. I mean, one of our professors was an expert in the Normans, and he didn't seem to mind them per se. He quite liked them. I don't think it was a...
Are you talking about Brown?
No.
There's a famous professor who he was English, and he wrote a bunch of stuff about the Normans. Trying to remember his name, but yeah, he would kind of be like the, you know, the exception to the rule, where he even said in some of his books, if I'd been there at 1066, I would have been right there with King William, you know.
Traitor.
Right, he was a traitor, exactly.
Traitor. Yeah, I mean, historians try to be objective. I mean, even I have kind of revised my opinion of them a little. I don't perhaps despise them as much as I used to. I still mostly despise them. But although I'll add a caveat to that, it's mostly William the Conqueror we have the beef with, not all Normans.
All right, so we'll get a couple more questions here. This is from Yeet Naba. I almost pronounced that one. I know Æthelflæd was kidnapped during a failed raid, but how did she get out? And if she was ransomed, who paid the ransom? What do you think about
that particular story was one I didn't actually include that in my book in the end, or if I did, I'd include it in a footnote, because it's mentioned in a lot of really late sources, like 13th, 14th century sources, but there's no original source for that story. It may be a story that developed later on. The story was she was actually on her way to marry the Lord of the Mercians and got holed up in a old fortification, had to fight her way out. Was one story is that she had to fight her way out. That was sort of her first military engagement as a teenager, is that she rallied all her household around her and fought her way out. It's a good story, but we don't know whether it actually happened or not. Yeah, the story is that most of her soldiers were killed, and some versions I think say that her husband arrived just in time. Some say that she sort of managed to fight her way out. I think there is something about her possibly paying someone off, but I think they usually involve her just holding out there until help arrived, or in some cases actually fighting her way out and trouncing the Vikings in the process.
All right, and then Quetzalcoatl asks, how independent was Mercia during Æthelflæd's reign? Wessex was the dominant power, but did she rule in conjunction with Alfred and Edward, or was she able to rule independently?
She didn't need Edward. I mean, they worked together to retake certain towns and build others, but her rule in Mercia wasn't dependent on her brother. She was ruling Mercia before that. And don't forget, she's older than him. She's got a few years on him. So yeah, from the time of her marriage until her death, she's ruling Mercia first alongside her husband and then by herself for 7 years. So yeah, she doesn't necessarily need them. I mean, her father arranged her marriage. There's definitely an independent streak in the Mercians. That much I will say. So there's a few sources where her husband is sort of sneakily referred to as King of Mercia. There's one or two Irish sources where she's called the Queen of Mercia. And her daughter, actually, for a brief time after her death, was possibly installed as the ruler of Mercia until she got deposed. That was for a few weeks, maybe a few months. So it just shows there was that independent streak, that they still sort of wanted their own ruler.
Yeah, I remember reading about her daughter. I can't remember her name at the moment. She's
Elfwin.
That's right, Elfwin. And she is kind of a shadowy figure. There's just a little bit of information about her from what I remember. Yeah, like you said, she was briefly installed as her mother's successor, and then she kind of mysteriously disappears. I think there's some ideas that maybe she was placed into a convent, and other ideas that maybe she had a darker fate. But the idea is that maybe she was gotten rid of to help facilitate the union of Wessex and Mercia.
Yes, Aethelswith's fate. The official story is she was taken to a convent, possibly in Wessex. We know she was deposed by her uncle, actually, Edward himself. The reasons we don't know, possibly because she was a threat to his power. There was a new Viking warlord rising at that time, and he might have felt it was a threat. Sort of, he wanted an independent front, but yeah, it might have just been that he wanted the West Saxon dynasty to remain. I mean, the fact that he did it after his sister's death, at least, you know, he would not have dared to do that to his sister. Ever, I think.
Right. And then Eduardo says, wait, he had a different, this is the one I was going for. Yeah, from Cyclone. Forts were more likely to be wood back then, right?
Not necessarily. It depended on what you were building. If you were building a fort, then yeah, maybe wood. But the thing about boroughs, oh yes, I love the picture.
There we
go. A borough could be a fortification, but a borough could also be a town, really a walled town. And in fact, some of the boroughs that Æthelflæd built are actually cities today. There's Stafford, which is a city. There's Tamworth, obviously, although that existed a little bit before her. Another one that is attributed to her is Runcorn, again, which is still a city. Some of them are still around, some of them are still in existence. So, and she was building them on Roman patterns. She literally based them on the way that the Romans built cities. So, walls, some might have had wooden palisades, but others would have had stone walls. I do believe there's a surviving section of walls that was actually excavated in Tamworth. That I think there was actually a stone section there, but sometimes they also reused Roman fortifications. So if there was a bit of a section of Roman wall left, they might shore it up with rubble a bit.
Yeah, and this is a big part of Alfred's success, and then of course his daughter Æthelflæd's success and Edward the Elder's success is the use of these boroughs in the era of the Viking invasion.
Just disappear for a moment.
Oh, that's fine. In the era of the Viking invasions, one of the big problems was that the Vikings were able to come in through the rivers and penetrate into these populated areas very easily, and they were able to devastate, these towns, these villages, the countryside. And what Alfred and his successors did was build this system of forts, these boroughs, these fortified villages, towns that could withstand these Viking raids. And this is something that Æthelflæd very much took up and carried on in the tradition of her father, and was very successful at. And I believe maybe we could touch on this a little bit, Joanna. She was instrumental in getting London away from the Vikings. Isn't that correct, or something like that?
And there was indeed a battle in London, wresting it away from the Vikings. It's a bit, we don't know for certain whether or not she was involved in that. Her husband seems to have been involved. Whether she was with him or not, Alfred, I believe Alfred himself was involved, although he was getting on a bit by then. The Lord of the Mercians was involved. See, London for a time was technically a Mercian city. It was technically under Mercian control. It was contested a lot, though, because it was quite close between the borders. So, obviously, if it's a Mercian city, is it the Mercians' duty to look after it? Is it the West Saxons? Alfred and her husband were working together, so she may have been involved. I believe there was something about her marriage treaty that there was ceding some Mercian cities over to Wessex. And I think London may have been part of a treaty at one point, but whether she was involved in retaking London, I don't know for sure. It's nice to think she might have had some involvement in it. I believe the conference she went to, or the discussion about the planning of cities, was in London. But I hasten to add, London was not the capital of England at this time.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So, guys, we're kind of coming toward the end of today's stream. Get your final questions ready for Joanna. And while we're doing that, I'll just jump back to her book. This is The Warrior Queen, The Life and Legend of Æthelflæd, daughter of Alfred the Great.
They did do a good job with the cover, I have to say.
It is a really good cover. And I mean, I love that statue of Æthelflæd, so I think it works really well. This is a few months back when I was going through a big phase of reading all about Anglo-Saxons and Vikings. This was one of my favorite books.
Oh, thanks.
So really is a good one to read, especially alongside if you pick up Asser's Life of King Alfred, and then get some of the collections of primary sources from this period. This book goes well right along with that stuff. So,
and I would recommend some of the other biographies as well. There is also, I haven't actually got it on the shelf. There's one by Tim Clarkson that goes a lot more into the military aspects.
Okay.
And there's Tom Holland's little book as well, not the actor Tom Holland, the historian Tom Holland. He wrote what's known as a Ladybird book. They used to be children's books. It's actually for adults, but it's a little book, brilliant illustrations in that on Aethelflaed. Actually cites mine. I got it signed by him. Very nice man. Yeah, that's really good if you want sort of like an introduction, and then just read mine afterwards.
Yeah, and Chris here says, where can you find the book? I've actually got it linked down below in the
Amazon and any good bookstore.
Yeah, absolutely. But just click the link below and you can pick it up.
Actually, the Book Depository is very good because they will deliver internationally. Even Amberley Publishing will actually deliver internationally as well. There's always Amazon, of course. So those are the best websites for international delivery.
So we'll go ahead and grab a few final questions here. Joanna, it's been a lot of fun having you on. I'm glad we got to kind of do a proper show finally.
Yes. And I have actually written a second book. I don't know when it's coming out. Not about Æthelflæd. This time I've moved to the 15th century.
And what's the topic for this one?
Margaret of Anjou, wife of Henry VI of England. That was an interesting one. All about the Wars of the Roses.
Okay, War of the Roses. Yeah, that's kind of a period. For me, like after the 13th century, I kind of stopped being that interested. I don't know why that is. I just
you're like not really medieval.
Yeah, I guess that maybe that's what it is. In fact, even the 13th century sometimes I start to kind of lose interest. But yeah, that is something that I know. I do want to know more about the War of the Roses, so maybe I will start with your book.
Yes, and there may be other books in future. I mean, I'm looking at possibly Matilda of Scotland, who was actually the wife of Henry I of England. You know, she's a woman I'm interested in.
Henry II's mother, right?
No, his grandmother.
Oh, his grandmother. Okay. Okay, that's right. Yeah. Well, so yeah, was she the one who was briefly married to the Holy Roman Emperor?
No, that was his mum. His grandmother was the daughter of the King of Scots and Saint Margaret of Scotland. She was actually the great niece of Edward the Confessor.
Okay.
That was a.
And Dorothy says, "Thank you." Well, thank you, Dorothy.
Thank you.
Dorothy's actually going to do a stream with us pretty soon. She knows a lot about King Baldwin the Leper of Jerusalem, so that'll be
fun. Yes, of course.
She's kind of a walking encyclopedia for.
Oh yes, that sounds great. A little bit about him, a lot from your channel.
Yeah, he's pretty interesting. All right, we'll jump through a couple more of these questions. This is from our good buddy, resident Carolean. He says, I heard Alfred had standing armies. Definitely, right, Joanna?
Standing armies are an open question again. It's one of those things that, how do you define a standing army? The thing he did a lot was he built the boroughs, and there was supposed to be a certain number of troops who would be the garrison in each one. There was also, I think there was also an overweening idea with the boroughs that they were not meant to be more than a day away from any one particular place. It was like an early defense system for the Viking raid. So there would always be someone to come from one of the boroughs. There would be some sort of force to come from one of the boroughs who could deal with those pesky Danes.
Yeah, I think what Asser says, right, is that he says something like he took, you know, the men and kind of divided them in these roles where like some would be acting in defense, some would be taking care of other things. Like it was kind of a system that he came up with where you sort of rotated
them around. Yeah, that was kind of probably the closest thing that came to a standing army. I mean, the Victorians, bless them, like to attribute a lot of things to Alfred. They like to say, oh, he was the father of the British Army. I wouldn't say it was a standing army in the sense that we would know it now, as more in the sense of, I'm not going to say a militia, but it was sort of the troops were at ready for when they needed them, but they weren't full-time soldiers per se.
Yeah, I guess kind of the way we think of a standing army today wouldn't be the same thing, but it is.
No.
But he did kind of organize the defense.
The defense of
where it was more prepared to deal with the Vikings, whereas before there was a lot to be lacking when the Vikings would show up.
Yes, quite sort of the smash and go. I mean, what surprises me always in those days is how small some of the armies were.
Oh yeah,
maybe a few thousand, if that.
Yeah, that's actually one of the things I find kind of charming about the medieval world. I mean, everybody thinks, oh, well, these battles must have been just, you know, hundreds of thousands of men, but no, not at all. I mean, you know, medieval armies, they were tens of thousands. A really large army would be like, you know, 15,000 men or 20,000. That's just huge. But like especially during this period, I mean, some of these major engagements between the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings were, you know, several thousand guys on each side, and there's kind of a gritty quality to that I think is kind of charming.
Yes,
if war can be charming.
Indeed. Well, the population was a lot smaller, so
sure
you can't expect huge armies.
All right. Yeah, we're kind of coming to the end here, but you know what? I'm going to throw a question at you, Joanna, that I think is kind of interesting. I've actually been doing a lot of research lately about Charlemagne and good
old Charlemagne.
Yeah, good old Charlemagne, and the the massacre at Verdun, where he killed thousands of these Saxon men, and some historians who deal with the Viking Age have you know where I'm going with this, have speculated that maybe something about Charlemagne's expansionism and his treatment of the Saxons kind of was getting back to the Vikings in Scandinavia. And I think, for example, one of Charlemagne's big enemies when he was fighting the Saxons was this guy Widukind, who had a wife who was Danish. So, you know, they share the same pantheon of gods. And what do you think? Do you think
I've heard of this theory, but to me, it doesn't add up, because for a start,
and just so everybody knows what we're talking about real quick, what we're talking about is the idea that Charlemagne's expansionism maybe contributed to the Vikings.
Oh, I've heard of that. Yeah. The reason that doesn't make sense to me is that the Vikings who attacked England first were not Danes. They were Norwegians. And why did they attack England, not France? It's like, so Charlemagne attacks the Danes, so the Norwegians attack England. That makes sense. How? It's like someone steals your car, so your friend burns down their neighbor's house.
You're really mad, I guess, right?
Yeah, the Danes didn't come until decades later to England, at least. Yeah, I'm not convinced about that one. Yeah, it's been speculated that one of the major impetus for the Viking raids actually was to take slaves, because they were valuable. Yeah, I'm not.
Especially, I mean,
it might have brought Europe a bit more to the attention of the Scandinavians, but it wasn't the cause for the way. You don't go attacking the whole of Europe just because of that.
And where did the Vikings sell most of their slaves? Would they have taken them to like Constantinople or
some of them.
certain parts of the Muslim world? Obviously, that's probably where most of the demand for, or where you could get the best pay for slaves, I guess.
It just depends where the market is, really. A lot of them, some of them were in Byzantium. Some of them, it's been speculated, might have been, sort of North Africa, maybe sort of areas around the Mediterranean a lot.
Mm-hmm.
They have even discovered Arabic coins in some parts of Scandinavia, actually, even one or two in England. Yeah, it was basically where the money was around the Mediterranean.
All right. So really good interview. Yeah, we're kind of getting into our final couple of minutes here. Let's see, there's several good questions here. This is probably a good one to get toward the end here with. Nicholas asks, what would be the possible interaction between the Anglo-Saxons at the time and the Carolingians?
They had quite a lot of interaction. Charlemagne, in fact, one of the leading scholars in his court was Alcuin of York, who was an Anglo-Saxon, or possibly a Briton. A scholar from England. He was very involved in Charlemagne's educational program. Yep, they definitely interacted a lot. There were obviously cross-cultural things going on there. In fact, I think one of the Anglo-Saxon kings sort of almost idolized Charlemagne in a way. They sort of wanted to model themselves on him. And I believe there was one major European, it might have been Rome, that had sort of a Saxon quarter at one point, or a sort of Saxon area where a lot of pilgrims and even immigrants would settle. It's alleged that King Burgred of Mercia made his way there after he was deposed.
Yeah, in some ways, the Anglo-Saxons really contributed to the Carolingian Renaissance. Just because,
they did.
Alcuin of York, who was probably the biggest intellectual behind the Carolingian Renaissance. He was an Anglo-Saxon from Northumbria, and Anglo-Saxon England actually had a longer tradition of
I admit I have at times cried reading about Alcuin of York and the library at the monastery of York, which was destroyed in the Viking raids. Such a nerd.
No, I can understand that.
The thought of all those books, no.
Yeah, why didn't the Vikings appreciate books more? I don't know. So let's we'll take one or two more questions here, and then we'll say goodnight to Joanna. Let's see here. It's always hard to choose the final ones. Here's a good one. Another one from Quetzalcoatl. Why isn't Aethelflaed more well known? This was a great interview. Thank you both. Well, thank you, Quetzalcoatl. We appreciate that.
I think she's getting more well known now. So the last few years, her reputation is starting to get a little better known because of certain books and certain TV shows, and of course the anniversary of her death in 2018. She's starting to get a little better known. I mean, previously, I think a lot of it was just that the Anglo-Saxons weren't very well known. I mean, King Alfred, if a lot of people heard of him, was just the king who burned the cakes. That's the tradition in England. He's just known really as that. He wasn't very well known here. Yeah, it's a good story, but it's almost people know. And I mean, a lot of people don't know about a lot of medieval figures. So I mean, yeah, it's almost forgivable, almost. And there aren't a great deal of sources on her. Most of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and a few others. You have to kind of dig and delve to find things.
All right, and Cherokee Gypsy says Joanna is a terrific guest.
Thank you. I mean, there is a theory that she was written out of history in one West Saxon version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which it's possible. But the Mercians made sure she wasn't.
And then Edward Dunn here says, lovely discussion. Thank you. Well, thank you, Edward. So, all right. Well, with that, I guess we have kind of come to the end. So, guys,
I always love that illustration. Sorry, that last one, Æthelflæd le Sage. I mean, my French is a bit rusty, but doesn't that mean the wise?
Oh, this one right here.
Yes.
Yeah, and I wanted to include these just because these are closer to period depictions of her. Obviously, we don't know exactly or really anything about what she looked like, but it is kind of interesting to get closer to the Anglo-Saxon sources as opposed to our Victorian imagery. And then, of course, I included this book just to kind of show how she's portrayed nowadays.
Margaret C. Jones. That's a very good book as well.
All right. Okay, well, Joanna, thanks so much for being with us.
It was great. It's always fun.
Yeah, it was a really good interview. And
anytime you want me back. And I still listen to Real Crusades History podcast. I'm very
awesome. Well, I think what I'm going to try to do is for the next one, we'll do the one about Baldwin IV. And once you're done with your book about the War of the Roses, well, we'll have to, finally do a War of the Roses.
It's actually done. It's been sent off. When it comes out, I don't know yet.
All right. Well, we will look forward to that. So thanks for being here, Joanna. Everybody check out her book. It's linked in the description down below.
Definitely.
And we will see everybody next time.
Trying to get my